And so IIT says, well, there are 5 elements or properties that any conscious experience whatsoever, any conceivable conscious experience has. It exists, the experience exists for the subject. It's intrinsic to the subject. It doesn't depend on anyone else, doesn't depend on you or my parents or anybody else. It's just an intrinsic property of a system, so that makes it subjective. It is structured in a particular way it is. So when I'm thinking about this, eating a slice of pizza, it tastes like something. You can taste the different aspects of it. You can taste the cheese, you can taste the dough. You can it tastes different when it's cold or hot. When I'm looking at the screen right now, when I see you, I can see left, right, up, down. There's spatial relationships. There are these faces that move about. So it's very rich. So it's highly structured. Each experience is a specific way it is. It's specific, So the experience of eating this leftover pizza feels in a very particular way, which feels quite different from when the pizza is fresh out of the oven, which is, of course, it's very different from the way you guys look on the video, which is very different the way near-death experiences feel. So each one is a specific way it is. It is also holistic. It is integrated, it is unitary, because when I look at you, for example, I don't have 2 conscious experiences seeing sort of the left field or the right field. I don't have 2 conscious experiences of sort of tasting the dough and tasting the old sort of, the taste of the old cheese. It's a single integrated experience where I can identify different flavors. And it's definite. Means that this experience, there are certain things that are in it, in this experience of eating leftover pizza. It's primarily an experience of taste, although there may also be some crunchy texture, and I may look at it, so it may also have visual component, but it excludes an enormous number of other things that are outside of it, right? It doesn't include the way moon glade looks, when you see the moon shining on a lake, it doesn't have the component of pain. So any conscious experience has these five properties. It exists for itself, it is structured, it is a specific way it is one, and it's only one. So those are the 5 axioms. And IIT argues that you cannot doubt them. Any experience has this. For how would it feel if the experience wouldn't be the specific way it is? How would it be if the experience isn't definite? And then from then, it tries to derive something about the underlying physical mechanism, right? So you'll have a system like your brain or my brain or the brain of a mouse or the brain of some other creature, or it doesn't even have to be a brain. You can look at any physical organ, my heart, my liver. You can even look at a bunch of transistors on a computer, and you can ask, what is it about this system that's in a particular state, with some neurons firing and some neurons not firing, with some transistors on and some transistors off, that gives rise to this experience. And then it has 5 associated, so for each of those axioms, there's an associated postulate, sort of essential properties of the underlying physical substrate. And it calls this intrinsicality, composition, information, integration, and exclusion. And it starts this postulate by asking, what does it mean to exist? And to exist, it postulates IT that that's a system. In order for it to exist, it has to make a difference to something else, or something else has to make a difference to itself. Otherwise, it doesn't exist. So it's a common principle rarely acknowledged in physics and science, but we use it all the time to exclude things. We say, well, they don't exist. And what do we mean by don't exist? Well, they don't make any difference. Whether or not you believe in them, whether or not they exist makes no difference to the system you study. And IIT tries to make that very much operational by saying, well, let's look at a particular system in a particular state. Okay, so here I have a state of n neurons or n transistors or n whatever they would be, superstrings if you want. and they're in some state or the other state. And so now I describe how the system evolves. Each system has what's called a transition probability matrix, a dynamic law that tells you, okay, given it's in this state, this is what it might do next. If it's probabilistic, you can say, well, it might go to this state or it might go to that state. If it's deterministic, then you can write down explicitly the states, and you can track the system as it evolves in time. And the theory says, in principle, once I have such a transition probability matrix, once I have a dynamic law that describes the system, I can compute how much it exists for others, that's extrinsic existence, and how much it exists for itself. And per this first axiom, and per the first postulate, intrinsicality, how much a system exists for itself, that's what it means to be conscious. Maybe this is a good point in time to, so for me also not to give an hour-long lecture, to stop.
Yeah, brilliant. That was really good. I just have to apologize to our viewers that we weren't live that whole time. The whole video has been recorded, but we actually went live just at the start of Christof describing the view there, but the whole video will be available at some point. So that was a really comprehensive description. So maybe we could take those two parts. I think there's maybe two things you covered there. I mean, so just to start off with what might be interesting to the viewers. I mean, one thing that's I find very interesting, perhaps unique about the integrated information theory, is that not only is it defended through the conventional empirical methods of neuroscience, which we'd like to hear you talk about at some point, but also, as you said, it starts from appeals to what we can know about consciousness through introspection, this idea that we can know certain facts about the nature of consciousness through introspection. And this appeals to me, maybe not Keith, this appeals to me because I think there are insights we can glean about consciousness from the inside, as it were. And so, as you said, you listed these 5 axioms, that it's integrated, that it's unified. So that's that starting point there. Keith, what?
I was just. I mean, I think we can learn things from introspection. I just don't think we can always take them at face value. But set aside my views. So the idea is that through introspection we get these axioms. We just by reflecting on consciousness as we have it, we get these axioms which tell us something about kind of the structure of consciousness, and then so that's telling us about consciousness as it's experienced, and then the postulates are then sort of looking for analogs, physical analogs of that structure that could be objectively observed and detected in the brain, say. So we're kind of translating those claims about consciousness into claims about physical structures that
into physical
support
substrate.
Consciousness. So that's the idea, is it?
Correct, yes.
So is the idea that those axioms kind of, is it that they sort of entail that there must be this kind of physical basis, or is it more that they suggest that that's the sort of physical basis that we should look for, but don't actually, there could be something else, but that would be the most, something that has those kind of features is the most likely thing to be supporting consciousness? Because it doesn't look like the postulates are exactly the same.
No, so at this point, you're correct. At this point, there is no logical chain of argumentation that I've seen that, although I think Julio differs here, that leads inexorably from having these axioms. Therefore, of necessity, these must be the postulate, and these are the only postulate that fulfill those axioms.
Right. Because it does look like some of them some of them I think everybody who thinks about consciousness, whatever, if they have other theories of the neural basis of consciousness, would still probably agree with many of those axioms. So,
here we're not even talking about neural correlates. We're just talking about the physical substrate of consciousness in anything. Right. It could be a bacteria, it could be panpsychism, it could be an elementary particle. Always saying there's a physical mechanism. And this arises out of my quest as a physicist. One reason I found IIT so attractive, because I always ask, what is it about the physics of the brain that makes the brain so radically different from the liver? My liver, as far as I can tell, is not conscious. Yet if I look at the biophysics of the liver, it's highly complex. It has nonlinear feedback. It has very complex representation. It has electrical activity. There's a membrane potential there. So why is my liver not conscious? Or maybe it is and it's not telling me. So I always ask as physicists, what is it about the physics of the system that makes one system to be, conscious like you and I, but other systems that also look pretty complex from a practical point of view don't seem to be conscious. And so ultimately there has to be something different about the physics. And so that's why I think it's important to move from phenomenology to physics. But physics comes after phenomenology. You start with the axioms.
So there's actually sort of three steps really. There's these axioms that we get from reflecting on our own experience carefully. And there are these postulates which kind of point to the kind of physical structures that we should be looking for, ones that have these features. And then we go from that in IAT to a specific formulation of the dynamics of the system, a mathematical formulation of the kind of mechanisms that would meet those postulates. Is that roughly it?
That's correct. And this is also where, as you look over the published literature, which is now growing very big, IIT is evolving. There's IIT 3.0 and now there's IIT 4.0. And what's evolving is that last step. It's the exact mathematics, the exact norm that you use to calculate certain mathematical property. That is evolving. The axioms haven't changed. The postulate really haven't changed. In this last step, what exact mathematical or physical measures do you use? That's changing.
This, of course, is where, I'm sorry, I know Philip wants to go, but this, of course, is where it gets very, very, very technical, very quickly. And there's a lot of really complex mathematics. I don't know if it's possible to give a very accessible introduction to that. But I know Philip wanted to come in there. So.
Yeah, so just while we're on this, just probe a little bit more. What exactly is supposed to be the relationship between the axioms and the postulates? I was interested that you said maybe there's a little bit of disagreement with Giulio there. He thinks maybe it is something more like a logical deduction between these axioms. So for the viewers, the axioms are in what we know introspectively about consciousness, and there's 5 of them, and then we somehow get to the physical.
I think you should have Giulio on your show.
Yeah. But what do you think then? What I think not a logical deduction. What is the relationship between the axioms and the postulates?
That the postulates are one way the axioms can be are instantiated in a physical mechanism in our universe, the universe we live in. And now the question is, what are the consequences that flow from them, and how can I test those consequences? Because ultimately, I want to get from phenomenology, from the way describing any one of my experience is, to mechanisms in order to manipulate them and understand them, and maybe build conscious creatures, maybe, or build conscious computers, or test whether a fetus is conscious, or my dog is conscious, or other things. And so therefore it's really important to get from phenomenology to physics. But I think again it's an inferential process.
So is the point that it's not that these features have to be the right ones, like a logical deduction, but they could be, and then we could start testing it? Is that the thought? There has to be.
I think for each of the axioms, there has to be some postulate. What does it mean for this axiom? What does it mean for a system, actually a physical system, to obey, let's say, to be definite? The fact that my conscious experience is very definite. It is one of many, but it's also very definite. What does it mean in terms of the underlying physics? And there, the postulate says, well, it has to be. You want to look for an extremum of this. So IIT, as it's well known, has this mathematical calculus, as I said, and that has 2 important features, and it's really important to briefly talk about them. So ultimately, the theory says that I'm looking at a system, I have its dynamic description, and this is formulated in what's technically is known as transition probability matrix that tells me, given I'm in this state, what is the probability I came from a state in the past, and what is the probability that I will switch to the following state? Given, I have a bunch of neurons, these are active, the vast majority of inactive. What can I infer from the immediately preceding state, and what can I predict about the next state this brain or this neural network or this transistor will be in? And once I have that, the theory says now you can do things. You can unfold the intrinsic, it talks about causal power. Ultimately, it's about causes that give rise to effects. You know, my system was caused by something in the past. My current brain state was caused by brain state in the past and will give rise to another, you know, will have an effect, you know, the next milliseconds or microseconds or the next second. And from that, you can unfold the causal power of a system into a very, very, very high form. It's a structure, sort of, it's a real physical thing. And ultimately, the theory says that what consciousness is this physical form, this unfolded intrinsic causal power, the causal power of the system upon itself. That's what consciousness is. It's sort of, Giulio calls it the central identity of consciousness, and that it's not just necessary and sufficient. Consciousness is my feeling of eating this leftover pizza is a particular physical form in this causal space. My experience of near-death experience is a physical form. Ultimately, it's not a behavior, it's not a computation, it's a physical thing. That's what the theory asserts. And it also says there's a quantity associated with it. So that explains the quality. Every form ultimately has to reflect the quality of that particular experience. So this unfolded causal structure of eating a slab of pizza, of old pizza, is going to be radical or very different from the causal intrinsic structure of a near-death experience, which is very different from the spatial experience of seeing extended blank wall. I'm looking here at a blank wall. It's highly structured. There's left, right, up, down, the neighborhood relationship, the distance relationship. This has to be ultimately mapped onto the physical structure. This physical form has to explain all aspects of the qualitative feeling of seeing an empty wall. But then it also says there's also quantity associated with that. And that's known by the Greek number phi. This is what people talk about when they say, you know, IT has this thing called phi. So phi is a pure number. It's not measured in bits. We can talk more about that because it's not the bits of Shannon information theory. It's a pure number that's either 0, and then the system, properly speaking, doesn't exist. There is no consciousness, or it's some number positive, bigger than 0. In principle, it's unbounded. It could be as big as, it's indefinite. But for any one system, it is a specific number. And one way to think about it, it's the irreducibility of the system in this state. It tells you how much quantity of, in some sense, it's sort of the quantity of consciousness. It doesn't explain the qualia. It's a measure of the quantity of consciousness. So the theory says there's this qualia, that is the structure of this unfolded intrinsic causal power. And then each experience also has this number associated with how irreducible it is. The more irreducible it is, the more conscious the system is in some sense.
So just say one more thing and then I'll pass over to Keith. So I mean, one key, it seems to me, if I'm understanding rightly, the central notion is this notion of intrinsic causal power. When I hear you talk, it seems very important that it's sort of real causal power. And I know that's part of the reason you don't think, for example, computers are conscious, because there's sort of something virtual. There's real causal power. And as I've always understood this, and correct me if I'm wrong, Christof, that it's something to do with the system constraining its past and future. So if we take the retina of the eye, the physical state of the retina of the eye at a particular moment, there's a huge number of possible states of the retina at the next moment, depending on the information that goes in the eyes, you know, whether I'm looking at a countryside scene or the inside of a paper bag, or, you know, whereas, although of course the brain responds to information, there's actually, at any particular physical state in the brain, there's actually quite a constrained set of physical states that the brain could take on at the next moment. And that's the notion of information. That's the notion of,
that's correct,
intrinsic causal power, that the future is constrained. Am I understanding this rightly? Or?
Yes, that's correct. How much I was constrained by immediate past, and how much does my current system constrain the evolution of this brain, of this system in the next next relevant time step.
So we start off phenomenology, and then we translate it in some sense into this notion of intrinsic causal power. and thereby we get a testable scientific theory. Yeah.
Yes, and for any system, in principle, in practice, it's difficult. It's not easy to compute, but in principle, for any system, you can compute this. So it's not something you can say it's airy-fairy, but it's something you can actually compute. You give me a system, in principle, I can compute this intrinsic causal power. And ultimately, consciousness, the way it feels, is the way the system is constrained by its past and constrains its future. Yes.
I think it might just be worth, because this was something that when I first encountered this theory confused me a little bit, and might be confusing some people. And the notion of information, I suppose there's a lot of people talk about the brain as an information processing system, and often what they mean by this is, that it's getting information about the world, it's tracking things in the world, and it's using this information to control responses. And so in this sense, to be an information processing system, something has to be hooked up to the world. It has to have sensors and so on. But this is a somewhat different sense of information, I think, here. It's more about the internal structure of the thing, the way the thing develops internally. And I mean, obviously brains are embedded, within sensory systems and so on, but it's not about the information that it's getting from outside, information about the world. It's about the way, about its own intrinsic dynamics. Is that right? I mean, I think there's some sort of distinction here. I'm not sure I'm getting it right.
Okay, so you're perfectly right, Keith. Information in IIT is not the Shannon type of information. So we take for granted, because we're children of the computer age and the internet age. Yeah. Whenever people say information, they mean information like how much information can I store on my iPhone, and you send me your information, then I'll get back to you. So that requires a sender that receives some data over a noisy channel to a receiver. And this works well if you're a scientist or a neurosurgeon that's looking down at the brain, you're showing the brain some images and you're recording from neurons, or you're doing brain scanning, and you can see, oh, I can read off when I look at the brain, the neurons or the brain areas going up and down, I can infer what's being sent outside. It's perfectly fine. So from an engineering scientific point of view, looking as an external observer at the brain, I can study it as an information transmission system and processing system. However, the brain, if you take the intrinsic view, which you have to take when you're dealing with consciousness, from the point of view of the brain itself, there is no sender, there is no observer. The only difference that makes a difference has to be to the system itself. So I think fundamentally there's something flawed. If you care about the brain as an intrinsic system, as many people claim to do, like psychologists, information theory, Shannon, information theory isn't very useful, because ultimately there's no information. Who's it being sent to? Where's the information being sent to? It doesn't make any sense. So IIT uses information in the older Aristotelian sense, informare, to give form to. And the idea is that for any one system in a particular state, it gives rise to these gigantic form in this intrinsic causal space, and that's what it means, informare. Now, given the dominance of information theory and bits, etc., this may not have been the best choice of words, but that's where we are. Everybody calls it IIT, and it's too late now.
And of course, IIT people, as you just said, they don't deny that the brain is an information processor in that Shannon sense. I mean, it is doing all that stuff, but that's not what explains consciousness. On your
because it's not for itself.
Right.
Yes.
So there's two kinds of information that are involved here.
I wouldn't call it two kinds, because I wouldn't call it two kinds. It's not measured in bits.
Right.
It's not measured. So I wouldn't call it. It's not. I would simply say it's nothing to do with Shannon information,
right?
The one that we're used to.
Yeah. Good. And so the thing it seems we haven't said much about yet is the integrated part. So we've got this idea of information, but we've touched on this integrated thing. But presumably there are going to be. I mean, the brain isn't just one sort of lump. It's got lots. We know it's got lots of systems within it that are doing different kinds of things, different aspects of sensory processing and so on, reasoning. What does it mean to say it's integrated? Is it that it all has to be well, can you explain?
It's not only
what
integrated, it's maximally integrated. Okay, so
right.
Let's take one extreme case. Let's take a split brain case. Okay, so a split brain is an operation that's still performed today, rarely, in which, because you have a patient suffers from epileptic seizure, they start, let's say, in the right hemisphere, and then they spread into the left hemisphere and become generalized. So to prevent that, the surgeon will cut under certain conditions the entire corpus callosum, the 200 million fibers that link my left brain and my right brain. I think Philip talks about that in his book. So in principle now you have two brain halves, the left hemisphere and the attached rest of the brain in the right hemisphere, that in principle are separate. Of course, they're still linked at the level of brainstem. But now you have a system, if you just look at brain, if you look at cortex, if you want that the system as a whole doesn't exist as a whole anymore, because it can be perfectly well described by the superposition of two independent systems. So if you have two systems, if you have a system and you want to describe how it evolves in the future, or you want to understand how it just evolved from the past, but you can perfectly well describe it as two independent systems and you don't lose anything, then strictly speaking, that system doesn't exist at that level of granularity. It only exists as a bunch of subsystems. The system, in order for a system to exist, it has to exist at that relevant level, where if you partition it into 2 or 3 or 4, you get something different than if you didn't partition it. And so this measure of integration, so what the theory says, you look at this you look at this measure of intrinsic causal power, and you ask, well, what happens if I partition the system in all possible ways? And there are many ways. And in principle, you partition it in 3 ways, 4 ways, etc. Does this, if you look, and then now you look at the difference between the treating the system as a whole, or treating the system, let's say, as two superposition of two components, does it make any difference? And you look at you consider only the partition that makes the least difference. And you do that for every possible system. And then you're saying, the system that is that has the maximum phi, that makes the maximum difference to itself, only that is the one that is conscious. All the other system that also may be integrated, but at a different scale, you pick the one that has the maximum phi, because only that exists for itself. The other subsystem may exist from an intrinsic point of view, but from an extrinsic point of view, but from an intrinsic point of view, only the system that has maximal irreducible causal power exists for itself, and only that is conscious.
Yeah.
So is that the explanation then of why, if you have, I mean, maybe this isn't right, but let me just, so you have different systems in the brain, say, that are looking for, detecting different kinds of things, like, one for color, one for shape, and maybe one for faces. And so those are all sort of discrete mechanisms, but what integrates that all into an experience of one face with a certain shape and color and so on, is that those systems together form a unity in this sense of integrated information, with a higher degree of this quantity phi than any of than the face one or the color one or the shape one individually.
Correct.
Is that the idea?
Therefore, according to the theory, although the smaller ones, they may also have phi, but at that given point in time, for itself, only this larger thing will exist for itself.
So the individual
only that is the maximum.
Right. So the individual components, their phi is smaller than the whole of them. So that, and it's that the fact that the total phi is greater is what unifies them, and what makes it into a single, and that into a single experience, a unified experience. So you have
that's entirely correct.
Mathematical explanation, or
yes,
an analog of the unity that we experience.
That's correct.
Yes.
And it also has, it has implication for the level of granularity at which physical level that exists. It also explains why you are conscious and I'm conscious, but there is no Keith Christof Uber consciousness, because the theory says, well, your brain has a phi, whatever million. My brain has some phi, some maximum of intrinsic causal power. We do interact. There's clearly some causal interaction between you and I. You ask a question, I answer it. But that is tiny compared to the vast amount of integrated information within my brain or within your brain. Therefore, because only the maximum exists, you're conscious and I'm conscious.
But suppose, it would be a prediction then, I guess, that if some AI researcher came along with some artificial corpus callosum that we could plug into each of our brains, that would rapidly transmit information between them, then we could form one consciousness.
That's entirely. I've written a story published in Nature called brain bridging. Oh, yes. So it's exactly as you say, Keith. It's inverse. It's an artificial corpus callosum, and it's the inverse of the split brain, surgery. So we start connecting my brain to your brain. Let's see, with some direct wires. So let's see, I do it between my visual cortex and your visual cortex, and you can begin to do this in a very primitive way in experimental animals. So what will happen? At first, I will see. Let's see, I have access to your visual brain, so I see a little bit what you see now, looking at me. But you're still you and I'm still me. Then we will add more and more wires between my auditory cortex and your auditory cortex, et cetera, et cetera. At some point, the theory makes a very precise prediction. At that point, when I add one more axon, one more wire, where the integrated information in our joint brain now exceeds by tiny amount the information in my brain or your brain, at that brain, there will be abrupt change. Abrupt change, you will cease to exist, the individual Keith will cease to exist, the individual Christof will cease to exist, and there will be this new conscious entity, this some amalgamation of you and I, this Ubermind. But it's a single mind. It now has 4 cortical hemispheres, it can talk through 2 mouths, it has 4 eyes, but it's one entity. And then if I reduce that bandwidth again, then you will fall back, I will become conscious again of Christof, and you're back to Keith again.
It's lovely, isn't it? But
it's pretty cool.
How would it's kind of, I guess, impossible to sort of imagine that phenomenologically. I mean, where would I be?
You would probably be considered psychotic. I don't think it's impossible. No, I think it's possible. I think it would be a psychotic state, or most people would interpret it as psychotic state, because suddenly it's not that you die and then it's suddenly. Suddenly the Keith, if I do this abruptly, let's say, then suddenly you would just see, you would still experience, you would just suddenly see through 2 sets of eyes. You say, well, yes. I mean, it's like being on 5D, DMT or some weird, psychedelic. But you would have a conscious experience. Now, it might be completely confusing. That's what I mean. It might resemble some sort of psychotic state unless you get used to it. But this thing would experience.
It's hard to imagine what point of view it would have. I mean, the point of view would have to have more than one point of view at the same time.
Well, yeah, it would look at the world from your eyes and my eyes, yeah. Because it has 2 visual cortices. Yeah. Now the question is, where, if you now ask this creature, where are you? If you ask me, I'm here, right? Unless you're blind, then it's lower down, or unless you're one side. And most people say they're here. So a good question is to ask, what about this entity? And I bet you something might happen just like happens in split brain. So immediately after the split brain, people are totally confused, and it takes them weeks. They get this alien hand, they start fighting with themselves, because the left brain disagrees with the right brain. But typically after a few weeks, people accommodate to that. So I suspect it would be something similar here.
I suppose, though, might somebody say here, well, but hang on, how is that now? Isn't that sort of getting into conflict with the axioms, with things like exclusion and degradation?
There is one conscious sensation. It's just now has its basis in 2 brain. I mean, look, we are already in this case. We are 2 brains, essentially. We have 2 symmetric cortical hemispheres. But we integrate it because we have 200 million fibers, and we never think about it. In fact, we didn't even realize this till the 20th century, right? In fact, it's definite. It's one experience. It's just one experience that has a substrate of 4 cortical hemispheres.
It's certainly fascinating. I like Philip coming up, but it's certainly fascinating that the theory, how you could, the theory then opens up these possibilities, which I think is a really interesting feature of the theory, that it, by a process of trying to explain, what seems at least to be the obvious starting point. It can take us into these realms of possibility in a rigorous kind of way. But Philip, you want to come in?
Well, maybe just to sort of summarize where we're up to. Just a quick aside. I thought it's fascinating you bringing in Aristotle there. So there is this philosophical lineage going back of equating the idea of existence with causal power. To do is to be and to be is to do. And what's fascinating about IIT is you're clearly linking those together. You've talked in one breath about intrinsic causal power, and in another breath about intrinsic existence, existing for itself. So equating them together, but also getting it sort of ultimately mathematically precise. So so that's a really fascinating idea. But so I guess there's just to summarize, there's kind of three ideas. So there's the information, which is this intrinsic causal power, integrated information. So the intrinsic causal power is sort of dependent on the connections in the way you outlined, but then also maximal integrated information. So as I've always understood it, again, Christof, correct me if I'm wrong. So this cup of tea probably isn't conscious because there's probably more integrated information in the molecules making it up rather than the liquid as a whole. But then in the brain, even though there's maybe a lot of integrated information in a neuron, in the relevant bits of the brain, there's more, because of the tens of thousands of connections, there's more integrated information in the whole than the parts. And actually, well, talking of,
that's correct.
And talking of interesting implications, I guess one implication of this is if it ever got to the point where there was more integrated information in the internet, we would all cease to exist as conscious entities in our own right and be absorbed in a sort of uber mind.
No, because because I can be vastly more conscious than you, and that doesn't impinge unless we are physically integrated with the internet. No, it's a maximum over that substrate. That doesn't mean there can't be other. Clearly, people, people would clearly vary according to IT in how much phi they have, right? We vary across our life cycle. When we're born, we probably have very little. When we start to experience things, when we go through puberty, we experience drugs and alcohol and sex. Our consciousness changes. At the end of life, with dementia, it may go down. No. It's not the maximum in the universe. My consciousness exists. You look at over this substrate, and it's the maximum of this substrate. And this is very common in physics, right? There are all sorts of extremum principles in physics that say, the right solution, what actually exists in the universe, is the maximum over this particular, function.
Right. Okay. So you have to be very integrated between the people. So what we're now focusing on is the so-called exclusion postulate, which is the final and fifth postulate. So we first met Christof in a conference on IIT, which is the shortening for integrated information theory. We haven't actually stated that, in New York, in New York University in 2015. And there's a really interesting talk by David Chalmers there, which the slides, I don't think he's ever made it into a paper, but if people might be interested, that the slides are on his website, which are very interesting. But one thing he did press was some of the moves from the axioms to the postulates, and in particular, the connection between the fifth axiom and the fifth postulate, so the exclusion axiom and exclusion postulate. So let me just put from memory the thought, and then maybe you could give your thoughts on it. So, right. So the exclusion axiom, the axiom from introspection is that, as I understand it, that my consciousness has a definite boundary, that for any experience, I either have it or I don't. So that seems pretty plausible introspectively. But then the exclusion postulate that we've just been discussing is that for any conscious system, there are no conscious systems within it, nor is there a greater conscious system that encompasses it. And I guess Chalmers was saying, well, it's not clear what the connection is to, perhaps a vivid way of putting this is, with respect to my own view, panpsychism, just as an illustration, we panpsychists tend to think the brain is made up of conscious particles. So in that would be inconsistent with the exclusion postulate, because I'm a conscious system and there's conscious systems within it. But it seems like I could still accept the exclusion axiom that my consciousness it has a definite boundary. There's nothing vague about it, while still thinking there are little conscious subjects within me, or or even cosmopsychism, that there's a greater conscious mind that I'm a part of. So what would you say about they don't seem obviously connected, the exclusion axiom and the exclusion postulate?
No, if you come to what, so then you get into this problem of how do I not experience my different consciousness of my single neurons? I only have one conscious experience. And I claim that's of this, I call it a whole, W-H-O-L-E, the whole. I have no evidence whatsoever that there are multiple, that there are 100 billion, that's roughly the number of neurons in my brain, 100 billion conscious little entities in my head. And so I've always found that very implausible. And of course, then you get also into this problem, you know it well, the correspondence problem of panpsychism. And IIT elides all of that by saying, no, just like in many principles in physics, so I'm a physicist, I really like the extremum principle, that only the extremum exists. Only in this case, the maximum of IIT exists. So strictly speaking, yes, within my brain at any given point in time, when I'm awake right now, there's only one conscious substrate. Yes, now it may be well possible when I sleep and go into deep sleep, characterized by slow delta waves, then my consciousness, of course, disintegrates, right? If you wake people up from a dreamless sleep and you wake them up and says, Joe, what went through your mind? Usually people say nothing at that point in time when they're, in an EG characterized a deep sleep state. It may well be possible that because the brain didn't completely dissolve into soup, right? It's still the same brain, that in that case, in the sleeping brain, the brain, because of its functional connectivity, is different because of the existence of these delta waves, now did sort of effectively dissolve into shattered crystal with, 100,000 or million or billion separate little tiny IIT, tiny amount of integrated information, so tiny that compared to our waking consciousness, it's effectively zero.
Yeah.
But the theory says no, at any given point in time, there's only one.
So you might think, panpsychism is not plausible for different reasons, but I suppose I was just focusing on, but what is the connection between the fifth axiom and the fifth postulate? I was actually just thinking about this in preparation for this talk, and I think there is perhaps a way of linking them. I just like to put this. Maybe this is the point anyway, and I've just misunderstood it. But if we understand the exclusion axiom as the idea that consciousness is not vague in this technical philosophical sense, where a concept is vague if it admits of fuzzy borderline cases. So like tallness is a vague concept, there's no exact cutoff point between tall things and people who aren't tall. And that seems hard to make sense of with consciousness. As you say, any experience, I'm either having it or I'm not. It seems hard to make sense of the idea that it's indeterminate whether I'm in pain or not, for example. Now, if that's right, it seems to me, then we're going to want our neural correlates of consciousness to be utterly precise corresponding to that.
Yes.
Yeah. And that looks like it's hard to get. So if you compare to one of leading rivals, the global workspace theory, so just for viewers briefly, as the rough idea is that consciousness corresponds to information that's broadcast throughout the brain. That is to say, that's broadly available to physical systems in the brain. Daniel Dennett famously called it fame in the brain, or cerebral celebrity. Now, take that view. It seems to me it's inevitable. So how much fame is needed for consciousness? How famous does the information have to be? It's surely going to be a vague answer. There's not going to be any precise cutoff point. So it looks like there is going to be vague boundaries about, indeterminate cases, whether I'm having an experience or not. Whereas with the exclusion postulate in IIT, it looks like we can have precise cutoff points, because there's going to be a precise moment when there's more phi in the parts, the whole in the parts. So yeah, is that what you're getting at anyway, or is that just my alternative?
Yes, this was the example I just gave when, you and my brain would be interconnected. There comes a point in time when I add one more axon, when the phi will change completely, abruptly, discontinuously to encompass both you and my brain. Yes, so it's very precise, and it's counterintuitive, because if you talk to neuroscientists, they say, But wait, the brain is totally connected, 7 degrees of freedom. Everything is connected to everything else. How can there be boundaries in the brain? Because IT says in principle, these neurons over here are not part of the physical substrate, the neural correlate. Although they're, they by 2 or 3 degrees of freedom, they're connected. Well, those neurons there, it's very precise. There will be sort of, if you imagine some future qualia scope and map it onto the brain, there will be very precise borders for any one conscious state in the brain. And that violates sort of the intuition that, well, everything is connected to everything else. It doesn't make any sense to have any borders. With respect to consciousness, it does.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I think I'll hand over to Keith now, but I think I'm much more sympathetic to society now. I thought that through. So, I mean, it's a sort of, I guess, introspective, philosophically based, as I'm thinking of it, constraint on a theory. Consciousness is not vague. We know that through introspection. So any theory of neural correlates has to be non-vague, which is a pretty hardcore constraint on a theory. But yes. Yeah, that seems to me quite, now I'm thinking about it in that way. Keith, what do you think about all this stuff?
It's kind of following on from that. I think one thing that's worrying me here is that, I mean, when we think about consciousness, we think of it as something that has a function that has effects. Obviously, on what we say. If you ask me what I'm experiencing, I say, give you an answer. And being conscious of things makes us able to react to them in all kinds of different ways. And
I don't have that intuition, by the way.
Oh, right. Okay. Because the question I was going to ask is, what keeps that in sync with consciousness in this? Because that seems to be something that maybe we can explain in the other sense of information, in the terms of Shannon information, tracking things in the world and responding. And sort of what keeps that? What I was going to ask is, what keeps that in sync with consciousness in this intrinsic sense? So that if consciousness in this intrinsic sense, were to split, then there would be a split in the function. But
I think you can dissociate intelligence and consciousness. Mm-hmm. Certainly, according to the theory, you can have systems that are highly conscious, but that have very minimal sort of what we would consider intelligence. You can have systems that have high intelligence, but no consciousness. In fact, future artificial general intelligence, I think, will be of that nature. Or you can have anything in between. In the strict sense, so that you have to consider a narrow sense, sensu lato, or sensu stricto and sensu lato. So in the narrow sense, consciousness doesn't have any adaptive function because it's not about behaving. Unlike, for example, global neuronal workspace, it's about being. Ultimately, there's this physical system, it's in a particular state, it has a particular conscious experience. Okay, so it may not have any function. If you, for example, have a near-death experience, if you take certain types of psychedelics where you're completely radical dissociated from yourself, there's no more self, there's no more ego, you're still highly conscious, yet you're sitting there, there's no processing going on in your brain of any conventional sort, there's no information, but you're highly conscious. So in that sense, consciousness doesn't have an adaptive function. Now, in the broad sense, of course, systems are highly nonlinear, brains are highly nonlinear. They evolved, and you can show using, we've done this using sort of simulated evolution of artificial creatures. As they become more adaptive to the world, to their environment, they develop massive nonlinear feedback that automatically is associated with high phi, with high integrated power. So I think given evolution of systems, of these very complex, highly nonlinear systems, it follows from that these systems will be conscious, but they didn't evolve to maximize their consciousness. They evolved to survive.
So would it be, I mean, it sounds a bit as if you're saying that consciousness is epiphenomenal, that it's what? Side effect of the stuff that the brain evolved to do. The brain evolved to do this stuff, and it happened that in evolving to do this stuff, it developed these the high phi.
Oh, I see.
And that just made it conscious. And that just came along.
No, because ultimately, so this is a separate debate. Ultimately, this revolves around what does it mean to cause and will and free will. I think, if you want to get free will in a compatibilist way, this is what IIT says you need. You have the maximum amount of sort of freedom or free will, subject to the laws of physics, of course, when you have, when your brain is in the state of maximum intrinsic causal power. That's ultimately what it means to say, I caused to raise, I had a desire to drink some coffee and I lifted the cup to my lips. but yes, in a strict sense, and that's why also I think there'll never be a Turing test for consciousness. If you just look at input-output behavior, you can get those in artificial systems. You can simulate those without having any conscious, experience whatsoever.
I suppose, yes. I mean, this is slightly different thing. But how then do I? If the consciousness is an intrinsic feature like that, how do I kind of know that I'm conscious? I mean, do I have a system in my brain, another system that can detect, phi, and sort of tell me that, that
no, because that's an observer. You don't need an observer. That's the observer. I mean, so I don't know why you're worried.
Who is the subject of consciousness?
Ultimately, the physical substrate, whatever your substrate is, right? You could be a little paramecium. To be conscious is to be a maximum of causal power. That's what it is. That's all there is to the matter. So that physical substrate is, if you want, the subject. Right. Without using notions like self and personality and all of that, that physical substrate is the subject of consciousnness. It doesn't need any extrinsic observer to validate, oh, I'm telling you, you're conscious. Oh, now I get it, I'm conscious. No, it's for itself. That's ultimately what intrinsicality means.
Right. So if I think of myself, say, as this, this biological mechanism, that's sensitive to stuff in the world and so on, I think that's, it's made up of all these different biological systems, and that's me. That's not me in the consciousness sense. That's not me, the self that is conscious. The self that is conscious is some complex structure continually changing within my brain. It's some physical structure of neurons. That's the conscious me. And this is just a sort of biological, like a zombie that happens to have this thing inside it in a certain region of its brain. Is that fair?
So it shares some intuition with Buddhism that essentially consciousness is now and here. And yes, that is currently the maximum of at whatever the relevant time scale is, let's say 100 milliseconds, that is my conscious self. Of course, it also has memory. And so, it finds, myself finds itself in the same body every instant that I'm conscious. And it builds up memory of this, and this gives rise to my narrative self. But what really exists ultimately is the current maximum of causal power of the physical substrate. That's the only thing that exists for itself.
Right. Yeah, that's helpful. It helps me to get a grip on the position.
It's a stark vision of the universe. Everything else is external power, and so of course, I can never directly connect with your consciousness. All I can observe are these extrinsic entities, from which, if I have a theory, I can infer they probably also have subjectivity, because they have similar substrate to mine and they behave similarly. But all of that, of course, other minds is all a pure inference. I infer.
It's almost like this a sort of physicalist idealism in a way. And it's you see what I mean? That with sort of
that's correct. It starts with phenomenology. So in that sense, it's idealism. It starts with the only thing I'm really certain exists is me.
Yeah.
I think this is leading nicely into.
It's wanting to come in.
As philosophers, we would be remiss not to talk about the hard problem of consciousness. So there have been a couple of articles I've noticed in Philosophy Journal saying that IIT doesn't help us with the hard problem. I mean, I would say, first of all, just before you respond to that, it's not obvious to me that a neuroscientific theory has to address the hard problem. If you, for example, take the task of a neuroscientific theory to formulate neural correlates of consciousness, what is going on physically that's required for consciousness, then you can just, IIT could fulfill that by saying maximal integrated information. So where you've got maximal integrated information, you've got consciousness. Where you've got consciousness, you've got maximal integrated information. That would be an answer to the question, what are the neural correlates of consciousness? Okay, but I suppose at some point, people like me at least, would ultimately want the hard problem addressed, whether by neuroscientists or philosophers or whoever. And I guess the way to formulate that in terms of IIT would be to ask, okay, why is maximal integrated information correlated with consciousness? Why should that be? Don't we need some explanation of that? And well, I just...
So do you mean why in the Aristotelian telenomical sense?
No. Well, in the sense like, if you want to know why does water boil at 100 degrees, you look at the chemistry, you get an intelligent.
Oh, because I can give you, because it's a maximum of causal power. That's all there is to it. Look, I find this very similar to the debate in physics that's been ongoing over the last 30 years. We find ourselves in a universe where quantum mechanics is the best description we have at high temperatures and small spatial temporal scale, right, supplemented by general relativity. So people now try to ask, why does the universe obey quantum mechanics? Does it have to of logical necessity? Can we imagine other universes? Well, clearly we can. That's known as classical physics. Classical physics doesn't have these weird, superposition and coherency properties. We can perfectly well imagine. So then people say, well, maybe there's a multiverse. There's 10 to the 500 possible different universes, and each universe obeys a different set of laws, and we happen to find ourselves in the one that obeys quantum mechanics. This debate you guys have about the hard problem reminds me somewhat of that. What I live in this universe. You inhabit the same universe I live in. I want to explain why in this universe, which physical systems have consciousness, and what is it about the physics of the system that gives rise to conscious experience. A theory like IT, assuming it's proven to be the correct one, satisfies all of that. Just like in principle, quantum mechanics is the best description of the universe at high energies and small scales, right? So that's all there is to it. Could I imagine other universes in which a variant of phi maybe is true, or in which IT isn't true at all? Yes. So if you're looking for an explanation that of logical necessity, it can only be this and only this, I don't think anything can give you that. Nowhere, in no field of human inquiry is that possible.
Well, maybe I could just try and push back a little bit. Why
does something exist rather than nothing? Nothing seems to be the most natural state of being.
They seem to be a little bit disanalogous. So everyone has to take something as basic, the fundamental laws of physics or the fundamental physical facts. Even if you think God created the universe, you take God as primitive, or as you say, the multiverse for others. So it's all right, taking something as primitive. Now, but if you were gonna apply that to IIT, it seems to me that would make you a David Chalmers style naturalistic dualist. So Chalmers says, consciousness.
Oh, I'm horrified by that.
Let me just finish the point. Consciousness and the physical are different things, but they're tied together by fundamental psychophysical laws, as fundamental as the law of physics. So if you were to go for IIT in that David Chalmers naturalistic dualist style, you'd say, look, we've got integrated information and consciousness, they're different things, but there's a fundamental psychophysical law of nature that whenever you have integrated information, you have consciousness. And then, okay, then you could say, well, I don't need to explain it. It's just like the laws of physics. It's just the basic. But I take it you don't want to say that. I mean, just on the face of it, integrated information and consciousness seem very different things. Integrated information is a sort of quantitative mathematical notion, whereas consciousness is a sort of qualitative notion.
Okay, but
so we need explanation. How can these be the same thing? Just one more thing very quickly. I tend to think, like, as I said in the last episode, actually, it always reminds me a little bit of the Trinity, right? where Christians say, no, there's just one God. Okay, but then there's seem like different things. Okay, but they're just one thing. When you say, I mean, maximal integrated information and consciousness, they just seem totally different things. It seems paradoxical that they could just be the same thing.
No, maximum integrated information is just a number. They are different. This is why the causal unfolding argument is so important. The central identity of IT says, you tell me about any one conscious experience, your favorite conscious experience, whatever it is, okay? You tell it to me. Then I take your brain, in principle, in this particular state, when you're, having this wonderful wine from, Chateau Chateaubriand, 1924, and you're having this wonderful experience. And I'm telling you, every aspect of every qualitative aspect of that experience can be mapped onto the causal unfolding power. There isn't anything left over. If you tell me, well, there's also this particular feeling, then I can point to a structure and say, no, this is precisely what explains that. So this is why it's so important to get away from just the notion of phi. Phi is a single number. It doesn't do any justice to the trillion-dimensional causal unfolding crystal. Right? When you're looking at an empty wall, at a blank screen, so there's this nice paper by Tononi and Andrew Honerbo that it precisely maps the phenomenology of and explains why the phenomenology of space is so different from the phenomenology of flowing time, is so different from the phenomenology of pain. Even though all of these states may have a similar phi, the scalar number, the underlying unfolded intrinsic causal effect form is vastly different and explain every aspect of every conscious sensation. So there isn't anything left over on either the side of the explanandum of the causal power or the phenomena that you're trying to explain your conscious experience. There isn't anything left over. There's nothing gratuitous. That's what the central identity says. It may be wrong. It's a hypothesis, but that's what the central identity says.
Yeah.
I suppose the sort of objection that Philip's posing there is, I suppose, that when you as a neuroscientist, when you don't exactly look at these processes in the brain, but if you could track these processes in the brain with some wonderful scanning device, show them in all their massive detail, it's impossible. But if we can imagine this, and it could show these unfolding causal processes in all their richness and so on, so that we could so that you could actually, so that we see all these dimensions may be represented on some visual display. That would still be completely different from actually having the experience. Yet, so how can they really be the same thing? I think I guess that's the.
Well, no, so Thomas, I was recently rereading Thomas Nagel 1974 article, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And he leaves open the possibility it may be possible for an observer to abuse the existence and the properties of all, of that particular experience based on such a reading of, so the idea is I haven't seen anything to exclude that. At once I really see the physical substrate in the brain and I kind of unfold it, that I see, yeah, that's what currently the person is actually, that's their experience.
Right, so it's just a difference of perspective, and the first person perspective or third person perspective, it's the same thing.
Yeah, of course, because my brain looking at it is different from the experience of the subject itself. Yes, that will always be the case. And if
same target, yeah.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah, I suppose I'll try one more time, then I'll stop. I suppose I just have to difficulty making intelligible sense of the identity. So even if I'm having my experience of red and you give me this perfect mapping to this quantitative state of intrinsic causal power, I mean, they seem on the face of it very different things. One is a kind of subjective quality. One is a purely mathematically described.
It's you can describe it using mathematics, but it's a form. It's a physical form. It is more real than the external world, because that is your only experience. You don't experience the external world. You don't even experience, you have no direct access to the external world. Yeah, I know it feels different, but people also say, well, life feels very different from, biochemistry. I know biochemistry and life can't be the same, really, because they're fundamentally different. Well, we know that turned out not to be right.
Yeah, no,
I agree. It seems to violate our intuitions.
I guess the difference of the life case, I suppose. So I said I'd stop, but just I have to say something on the life case. That in life, all our data about it is third-person public observation and experiment. That is our data about life, and when we give a scientific explanation, that's what we're explaining. Whereas I think there is something unique about consciousness in that our fundamental way of knowing about it is our access to it through introspection. I think we know something about its nature. We know there's these qualities of what it's like to see blue, what it's like to smell coffee, and we want an explanation of those. And if you give me a purely quantitative description, it doesn't feel to me you've given me an adequate description, an adequate explanation of.
That's because we're not used to. No. That's because we are not used to dealing with. We are used to dealing with two-dimensional spaces because we can see them. It has to do with the geometry of our visual system on the plane. And if you look at even very simple system and you unfold the causal power, you're really talking about literally trillions. You're talking about 10 to the 30, 10 to the 40. I mean, you know, in these very high dimensional causal power, unfolded causal power. And so then quantity, you know, quantity turns into quality. That's what the theory claims.
Cool.
We probably hijacked you know, the discussion too much with philosophical concerns. Look, we've got you know, one of the most famous neuroscientists, leading neuroscientists in the world here. Shouldn't we ask him to just tell us a little bit about the neuroscience of consciousness, about what we know about the neural basis of consciousness and where it actually is in the brain? I mean, do you want to ask the question?
You want me to? Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, it would.
Well, I mean, that was the question.
Yeah. To hear more about the discussion. I mean, particularly viewers might be interested in. I mean, there is a dispute between neuroscientists about whether consciousness is in the front of the brain or the back of the brain, and IIT takes a stand on that. But yeah, just more generally.
Okay, so let me talk about two advances. So ultimately, a theory is only as good as its prediction, particularly those predictions that can be cashed in experimentally. Because I mean, the claim is IIT is a scientific theory. So the two big advances, or the two big tests that are being conducted, one is to develop what's known as a conscious meter. We have a clinical problem in the sense that there are probably worldwide a couple of thousand patients that are in a state that's very difficult to ascertain from the outside, called a persistent vegetative state, permanent vegetative state, or behavioral unresponsive syndrome, where you have patients like Terry Schreiber, she was the most famous one, that due to, you know, an accident, trauma, drug, alcohol, et cetera, in a state where they're clearly alive. So it's not a question of they're dead or alive, they're clearly alive. They may have periods where they open their eyes for 2, 3, 4 hours and then close them again. And this state can persist for weeks, months, years. In the case of Terry Schreiber, 14 years. And you simply don't know, because you try to interact with them, you try to ask them questions, you know, move your eyes, move your hand, you do it over and over again. And there doesn't seem to be also highly inconsistent evidence there's anything more than reflex or spontaneous behavior. There are also cases of during anesthesia, during catatonia. So there's a variety of states where we really would like to know, is there, we're now talking about human level consciousness present in these patients or not, and you have none of the standard behavioral based paradigms available, like tell me your name, or can you move your eyes to the left and right and up and down. So IIT already many years ago published a paper in Science where it says, well, what you do, it's called ZAP and ZIP. What you do, you probe for the degree of integratedness and differentiation. You put an EG net on the subject, the volunteer, or the patient, and you knock the brain by giving a pulse using a device called a transcranial magnetic stimulation device that briefly sends a pulse of magnetic energy into the brain that stimulates the brain, and then essentially you're looking at the echoes. You're recording the echoes, the reverberation inside cortical tissues, and that's what you pick up using this EEG electrode. And then essentially you can try to compress it. You compress sort of so you have this movie sort of in response to this pulse. You know, think about bell, you hit a bell with a hammer and you're essentially looking, you know, listening to the echoes. If the response to this pulse is simple, which is quantified using what's known as perturbational complexity index, you essentially try to compress it. If it goes below a universal threshold, 0.31, we don't know why, there's a single number in you and I or hundreds of patients where this has been tested, the volunteer is either in deep sleep or has been anesthetized, but if this complexity of this brain response is above this threshold, then the volunteer is either awake, or if you wake them up, they dream, or they're on a ketamine where they're dissociated but they're conscious, or they're a patient that is actually conscious, like a locked-in patient that can't move anything but their eyes, but they're fully conscious. This procedure is now being tested in a clinic, in a larger clinical trials here in the US, at Harvard, at UCLA, in Milan, in a number of sites, where we're trying to derive this on a very general condition to see, can this actually be a clinical useful device to test for the presence or absence of consciousness, depending on how integrated and differentiated the brain is. So this would be a practical, primitive, first conscious meter. And this is a big, if true, this would be a huge clinical deal. just practically helping people to assess consciousness and not consciousness. So that's progress, never been possible before. The other thing is, as you alluded to, Keith, there's now several experiments being funded by the Templeton World Charity Foundation that try to pit, it's called an adversarial collaboration, which is unusual in science, although most people outside the field think this is how scientists work all the time, but in fact they rarely do, where you get two different proponents of two different theories together in one room, and you get them to agree on a set of experiment that would decisively test, would they agree ahead of time. We do this set of experiments, and if the outcome is in this way, it supports your theory. If the outcome is that way, it supports my theory. This seems pretty logical, but it's very difficult to achieve for all sorts of political, scientific, financial, etc. Reasons. So we've done this now for the case of, there's two ongoing collaboration, one in humans, one in animals, that tries to test this, as you said, this idea that global neuronal workspace predicts that the footprint of consciousness, the neural correlates of consciousness are in the front of the brain, while integrated information theory, for principled reason having to do with the connectivity, predicts this in the back of the brain. Also, the two different theories have different predictions regarding the timing. IIT says for however long you're conscious, that there will be a physical structure in the brain, we talked about it before, that reflects this consciousness. So if you're conscious of something for 500 milliseconds, or 1,000 milliseconds, or 1,500 milliseconds, there will be this correlate in the brain that we can pick up using fMRI or EEG. While global neuronal workspace says, no, it's only the initial broadcasting of the information that really conveys the consciousness. If nothing has changed, there's no need to broadcast anything. So those are the two predictions that are now being tested in like 10 labs using fMRI, EEG, MEG, and implanted electrodes in patients as well as in monkeys and in mice. So it's a pretty cool ongoing, has been slowed down by the pandemic, of course, but ongoing set of experiment. All the data will be made publicly accessible. Anybody can download them. So it's a pretty cool instance of this adversarial collaboration.
That's fascinating. When will some of the results of that be coming in, do you think? When we get
well, all the first data will be done by this year. Then half the data will be blinded. People will train their classifier on the first half, will publish on it, and then we'll pull out we'll unblind the other data to see how good is this predictions. No, it's good. It's
really exciting.
It's good data hygiene. Yeah, so over the next 2 years.
That'll be fascinating to follow that.
And what is your view on where we're up to from data in the past about the front brain, back brain issue? Or
based on clinical data, where people lose bits and pieces of their brain or have the piece of brain have to be taken out by neurosurgeon, it's the back. So in neurosurgery, there is this term called non-eloquent cortex and eloquent cortex. So when you have to remove a piece of cortex because the patient has bad epileptic seizure or because of tumor, you try to avoid what's known as eloquent cortex, speaking cortex. So that's primarily, of course, Broca's area, because you don't want to render people mute. That's the other area, Wernicke's area, so people can understand human speech. You don't want to remove visual cortex and somatosensory cortex so people can feel and hear. But surgeons have discovered experimentally that you can remove very large part of what's called non-eloquent cortex, essentially cortex in front of the motor strip, without any apparent deficit. There are subtle deficits, but patients typically don't complain of these deficits. They go home and may lead an uneventful life for the next 10 or 20 years. And so due to experiment like that, also from brain stimulation experiment, where you have to stimulate the brain during neurosurgery, it's the back of the brain, sort of the posterior cortex, that really seems to be key, at least for seeing, for hearing, for touching, for feeling, for wanting, for having the feeling of volition, of voluntary doing something. That seems to be the back of cortex, that seems to be the essential substrate. So that's what the experimental evidence is right now. So it's exciting to me because it shows you can make, so for me as a scientist, it shows you can make progress in these ancient mind-body debates. And then, of course, you have to pursue the if the IIT gets validated, you then want to follow up some of its prediction in animals that are only not like us, like mice and cats and dogs that most biologists assume have sentience, but also in, how far does it go? How far does it go in the tree of life? Is this panpsychist intuition that you have, Keith, is that validated? Because IIT shares some of these panpsychist intuition that consciousness may be much more widespread than is conventionally assumed throughout the tree of life, and maybe even outside the tree of life in simple physical systems. But that's all speculation at this point in time. But I think educated speculation.
Oh yeah, we haven't even touched on the potential panpsychist implications. I'd love to probe all this more, but I guess we've kept you for 90 minutes now. Thanks so much for joining us, because it's an absolutely fascinating discussion. I think people have a much clearer idea of what the integrated information theory is now. And did you want to add anything, Keith?
Just to repeat that, I mean, thanks very much for your time. I think that was a great introduction. I hope people, now begin to be in a position where they can start to explore the view for themselves a bit more, do some more reading on it. I mean, I know there's lots of, there's your recent book. Remind me of the title.
Feeling of Life Itself. Yeah.
Feeling of Life Itself.
Right.
Yeah.
Very
I think it's an excellent
recommended
introduction.
And if people are interested, actually, Christof and I reviewed each other's books for the American Journal of Psychology, wasn't it? Forgetting now.
Yes, and also, of course, we have a review of your book coming out in Journal of Consciousness.
Oh yeah, there's going to be a special issue of the Journal of Consciousness Studies coming out in October on responses to my my book Galileo's Error, and Christof has extended his piece for that, and I'll write a response to all the pieces. So yeah, read Christof's book, and you could look at those if you want more.
All right. That was fun. That was very enjoyable.
Thanks so much, Christof. Keith and I are gonna stay on the film and pick you other, but thanks so much. It's been really good fun. And speak to you soon. Oh, you're filling the screen.
Yeah, and so are you.
How do you find that, Keith?
Hi. I don't know what people are seeing at home still. I just see a large you and a small me, but
yeah, we're both there. I think it's okay.
Okay, good. Well, that was good. I enjoyed that.
Yeah.
It's really hard to get into some of the literature on IIT, because very quickly some of it goes into mathematics that is quite forbidding. So I hope we manage to get some of the general shape of the theory across there. I suppose to really understand it, you do need to get into the mathematics, and I know that some people have engaged with it, critiqued it from a mathematical point of view. But I think that gave us we got the shape of the position there, I think.
Yeah, I think so. These notions of intrinsic existence and existing for itself that people might have heard in context of IIT. What the hell does that mean? And I think clarifying some of those. Also, people might be interested in I think Hedda Hassel-Merck's that's spelled M-O-R-C-H. Her piece on IIT in Philosophy Now is a very clear explanation.
It's a very clear introduction. Yes, I agree with that.
But yeah, I think we really pinned that down and got some of the, maybe we didn't go into all of it, but I just wanted, and I think we achieved, getting some of the foundational concepts clear, I think.
And I think what's really interesting about it is, I don't, that I don't like this idea of the intrinsic nature of consciousness. That's kind of what I resist. But that if you're going to take that view, then this is a really head-on sort of hard-nosed scientific approach to it. Yeah. And so I give it a lot of credit for that, and it does have a kind of elegance and a neatness, and also as Christof stressed, it produces testable predictions, which is a great thing.
Taking these abstract philosophical ideas and trying to mathematize them, whether you agree with it or not, is a sort of bold and maybe unique project.
No, you've got to do this, and then if it's, I'm sure Christof was the first to say, if it works out, it works out. If it doesn't, it doesn't. That's how to do it. It's so we should try and get a global workspace person on sometime to talk to get the other.
Well, next month we've got not a global workspace theorist necessarily, but Matthias Michel, who I think is a philosopher who knows a lot, who works heavily in neuroscience and is opposed to IIT, I think, and so
Yes,
maybe we'll get some of the other side
so
of
we
it.
yes, we can get some of it then. That should be good. Yes, that's,
I feel in the discussion actually, I feel I didn't do a very good job of pressing the hard problem. I think I got lost in the Trinity and dualism, and I think I got there. I think I just should have just pressed the basic idea that, you know, we want an explanation of these qualities, and it doesn't seem to be an able
I thought
to.
you were going. I thought you'd come in with a hi-fi zombie. You know.
I know. Well, I just didn't want to get into you know, you get lost in the arguments of Mary and zombies.
Yeah, and of course, you know, people with a scientific cast of mind tend to be totally unimpressed by zombie kind of arguments, because, you know, they say, you know, you can conceive of that. Well, good for you.
Yeah.
Doesn't prove it. Doesn't establish.
Yeah.
No,
I mean,
no.
I think it's good, rather than getting into those arguments, just talk about explanation. You know, you can explain the boiling point of water in terms of chemistry. I want an explanation of the blueness in terms of, and he did, to be fair, try and address that, but pressing explanation.
He's trying to do that. That's what he's trying to do. I mean, yeah, that's why I admire it. I mean, it's.
I mean,
I don't think.
Sorry.
No,
on the face of it, his view, I mean, is a materialist view. He's saying there's an identity with consciousness and this purely physical, quantitative notion of maximum integrated information. When I talked to Chalmers about this at this conference, and he seemed to think, we should have asked him really, we've just had him on, that Christof was more my kind of view, more a sort of Russellian monist, panpsychist kind of view. And it would be interesting, yeah, maybe you can interpret, Hedda Hasselmerk has interpreted IIT in those terms. But so that's what Chalmers thought. But it does seem from what he says, it's just an identity. It's maybe
I'm not sure. Does Tononi have a more sympathetic to a kind of dualist, property dualist correlation idea here? I'm not sure.
Sure.
It's interesting because, you know, there's a line of thought which I'm kind of associated with, I suppose, that, you know, it says, if you want to take a really hard-headed scientific, you know, approach to this, you can't really be a realist about qualia, about these really intrinsic properties. And, you know, Christof's, you know, trying to be a hard-headed scientific realist about those things, and you've got to give credit to that project.
Yeah.
I suspect that really, you know, the philosophical foundations aren't strong enough. But he has got well,
I suppose that's what, when you bring in philosophy, then that's going to be controversial, isn't it? Some people are going to say, well, what is this intrinsic existence?
The thing is I don't think you can bring in introspection without bringing in a whole host of assumptions about what introspection is and what it's doing and what you can learn from it and who's the subject of introspection, all this other.
I like all that stuff, you see.
I know you
but
do.
Yeah, I agree with you, though. You've got to engage the philosophy as soon as you do.
Yeah, I mean, you're explicit about, you know, the philosophical assumptions behind, you know, how you understand the data of introspection, and that's where we differ.
Yeah.
I think Christof, and I understand this, he seems a bit impatient with philosophers, and I don't blame him really. But I do think, I would, but I do think we needed a bit here, because I do think there are assumptions, methodological assumptions, you know, metaphysical assumptions that everybody's making, and you can't just sort of science those away.
Yeah.
But it's, one thing I like about it is, I do like about it, it has a beautiful elegance and a precision, and, you know, you have these sort of maps of conceptual structures with these multiple dimensions that correspond to the dimensions of experience, and so you're representing experience, well, you know, identifying experience with this complex multidimensional structure that has all sorts of you know, it's when you can sort of represent it, visualize it as a shape in multidimensional space, and it's trying to give a precise expression to this kind of stuff that we talk about introspectively.
Yeah.
And that ought, if phenomenal realism is true, that ought to be possible, really.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's something. Did we? There's some comments here. Someone said, Richard said in the comments, they would like to see Keith and Phil's brains fused together.
Oh gosh.
Someone said we can see you. I think they think we don't know we're still live, but nice talk, Christof. Do you think you will get Daniel Dennett on? Roman asks.
We can try. We can ask.
And there were some questions about what Christof thinks happens after death. I think he thinks that's the end of consciousness. I think he quoted the famous thing, "No brain, never mind." That the brain, the causal power of the brain is the consciousness, and so when the brain rots away, that's the end of it.
I suppose he might say that in the process of dying, or of brain losing function, the consciousness that kind of we have might start to collapse into subconsciousnesses before we actually die.
Yeah, sort of.
So the process of dying, it might be that you
unify. Yeah. So the consciousness will, when there's no longer maximal integrated information in the whole, there will still be some consciousness in the parts. It will sort of combine, and I mean, it's very kind of panpsychist in that regard. And Hedda Hasselmerk has worked this out in a very rigorous philosophical way. Right. So her view is that when the whole forms, the parts actually kind of cease to exist, or rather they become dependent on the whole. Yeah. So that's a way of making sense of, you might think it's a bit vague, this idea, because Christof said a few times, when there's maximal integrated information in the whole, the parts don't exist. Or then he says they don't exist for themselves. It's like, what? They don't exist anymore. You can see them. But Hedda interprets that by saying what happens is there's a switch. So before you get maximal integrated information, that the whole depends on the parts. And then when you get maximal integrated information in that whole, then it switches and the parts depend on the whole. And that's how, so the parts become sort of derivative from the whole. And that's the sense in which they don't exist.
And is that done in causal terms, that the whole has emergent causal powers that are not reduced to those of the parts?
Yeah, although I think she thinks that it might just look as though it's behaving exactly the same, and you might think that's a bit suspicious. If there's this radical change in nature where the system goes from the parts running the show to the whole running the show, but it looks like things just evolve the same, behave the same way, you might think. I've criticized the view on those grounds actually, but
I agree with you totally about her summary of IIT. It's a lovely little.
Yeah, it was actually an issue of Philosophy Now I guest edited actually and commissioned that. But what have you been up to, Keith?
I've been thinking about your stuff again actually. I'm thinking of writing a little.
What are you doing that for?
For that special issue, and I've been thinking about your stuff and a bit about that. What else I've been? I need to stop thinking about panpsychism. Actually, it's living in my head rent free, as they say. Wow, what else have I been doing? Oh yes, I've been working on working with Francois Camera on a piece on introspection, mapping different possible space of possible forms of introspection.
Oh,
so that's an interesting thing.
Well, I happened to listen to him on Richard Brown's Consciousness Live, and I was very impressed. I thought it clearly really cares about truth. I thought that really, and actually our critique of standard materialism. You know, his critique is kind of remarkably similar to the one I have, and so we should get him on at some point. That's
Francois, great guy.
Really interesting thing.
He's in Germany, I think, at the moment. You've been on holiday, though, haven't you?
What?
You've been on holiday. You've been surfing, I think.
Is that on Facebook? Paddleboarding. Yeah. I managed to stand up for about 3 seconds and catching up with family post-COVID in Tenby in Wales, which is a beautiful part of the world, Tenby in Wales. Finished marking, finally, sun shining. So, lots of research deadlines over the summer, but I've got to update the Stanford Encyclopedia entry, actually. So I wrote the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on panpsychism. And although it's sort of co-written, actually, I just kind of more or less completely wrote it from scratch, except for the history section. That was sort of, but then every few years you have to update it. So I have to sort of
rapidly evolving field.
Yes, cutting edge philosophy, Keith. We're on our way to finding the truth any day now. So
any day now.
Yeah, I should refer to your forthcoming paper, critiquing panpsychism. But sort of saying, but not in a qualified way, aren't you? Sort of saying, if phenomenal consciousness exists, then this looks like the way to go, but it doesn't. So
yeah,
it's a reductio ad absurdum, maybe.
I do use it that way, but yeah, no, I think people who are phenomenal realists but kind of mock panpsychism. No. These panpsychism are taking phenomenal realism seriously. If you think that phenomenality has nothing at all to do with functionality, that the two things just are completely independent. So it's the psychological. You could have all the psychological processes with absolutely no phenomenality. There's no conceptual connection between them. Right. Well, then, so why think that you need psychological processes at all? Why couldn't inanimate things have consciousness? Once you take this view that it's an intrinsic property, that it's just what it's like to be that thing, not to do anything at all, but just to be it. Well, then, why shouldn't an electron? Electrons can be, if all that you need to be conscious is to be the right kind of thing, well, electrons are very good at being. So
I'm not sure I like the way you're using psychology there. Psychology. I know you use this term in your paper, but I mean, is it connected to in the conscious mind? Chalmers had this notion of the psychological, which is sort of purely functional.
Yeah, that's
whereas I think of the natural way of thinking of psychology involves phenomenal consciousness. You might talk about someone's an anxious
it's what it's doing that matters. It's not it's the fact that it has this intrinsic feel to it isn't sort of making any difference to what it does. I mean, I know you think it's the same thing, so it's kind of we've got clearly but just using the word psychological just to be a purely functional notion. Well, I'll just say the same thing in functional terms. If you don't need to do anything to be conscious at all, you don't need to track, you don't need to be sensitive to anything in the world, you don't need to react in any way, you just need to be. Well, as I say, electrons can be just fine.
Yeah. We'll agree to disagree. We should maybe just quickly run over.
Yes, we better let people know who are still listening.
Matthias Michel. We've got a science sandwich, haven't we? We've got Matthias Michel talking about philosophy of neuroscience, I guess.
Science,
yeah. And Anil Seth, in the middle of August, talking about his new book, Being Conscious, which we're going to hopefully. Did you freeze for a second? And then mid-September, back to the philosophy with Helen Yetta-Chapel presenting an idealist theory.
Then we're getting some, maybe we won't announce it just yet, but we're getting some exciting big names lined up to follow on from that, aren't we?
Some exciting things to be announced for the second series of Mind Chat, and maybe we'll work out how to use the technology by then. But
we might even have the little intro titles running. That would be nice.
I know. My niece made this wonderful title sequence of music, and I can't work out how to do it. But anyway. Well, anyway, I think that there's one thing we agree on, isn't there? I think, Keith.
You say it first. That consciousness is.
Why can't we do this? Why can we never do it right? What is
consciousness is wherever it is, and then I say,
Anyway, the one thing I think we agree on is that consciousness is wherever it is,
nowhere else.